The wind in your hair, a gently swaying deck, the creaks of timbers underway, the murmur of the sea against the side of the ship. On some days, living aboard a pirate ship must have been truly magnificent. However, it's more than likely that days like this would have been few and far between, and most of us would have been completely incapable of surviving any time at all on a pirate ship. Even pirates themselves knew that their lives would be filled with violence, poor meals, and even more pitiful pay. Let's take a look at what it truly would have been like to live on a pirate ship. Welcome to Walk the Plank. The food. Pirates lived in a cycle of feast and famine, and one that got worse the longer the voyage and time they were spending at sea. Pirate ships generally stocked up on fresh produce as they set sail from port, carrying barrels of fresh fruit and vegetables as well as meat, eggs, and cheeses. However, these foodstuffs are perishable and wouldn't last more than a couple of weeks before they started to go bad. Pirate cooks were known to use heavy hands when adding salt and spices to their food, as they tried to mask the flavour of mould and rot that permeated everything over time. The quartermaster and his chefs would have done their best to keep everything cool and dry, but naturally the sea made its way into everything over time, making it difficult to preserve anything for long. After the fresh food was gone, pirates turned to salted meat and hard tack. A grueling diet for anyone, but particularly challenging for someone whose entire day would be spent out in the elements doing manual labour. The weather. Speaking of the elements, surviving at sea would have been fine for the most part, but pirate ships during the golden age of piracy had one constant fear: storms. Hurricanes and other big storms could be disastrous, as most often a crew would go down with their ship if it started to sink. The best thing to do was avoid a storm or hurricane altogether, although that was definitely easier said than done. Pirates would have to keep a close eye on the weather and use their knowledge of meteorology to try and get ahead of storms if they knew they were coming. Inexperienced ships would often get caught in squalls and simply vanish with 0 survivors. If you truly couldn't get away from the storm, it was often a case of each man for himself. The ship was more durable than the crew and might survive with only a few knocks. A person could easily get swept off the deck by waves that could be far taller than the ship itself. And once your feet left those planks, you were essentially a dead man. The waves were dangerous for the ship as well, as they could smash in the weaker sections or block the sails from catching wind to keep the ship moving. In a storm, the ship would be more stable if it had a full cargo on board. The weight in the hold would help keep the ship upright and steady. If the ship was light, it was far more likely to roll over and kill every person on board. But you couldn't just lash yourself to something heavy and hope to ride out the storm. The reason why hurricanes and other storms were so dangerous was that the crew had to keep working to protect the ship the entire time. As the wind was howling, rain lashing, waves slamming down onto the deck and blinding everyone with salt spray, the crew had to keep directing the ship into the storm and sail at an angle to the waves to make sure that the ship didn't take on too much water and sink. Not only did the crew have to stay on deck to pilot the ship, they also had to get up into the rigging to furl the sails and stop the canvas from getting ripped away. This meant that at least some people had to risk their lives up in the rigging, fighting with heavy sodden canvas on slippery wooden beams, all the while risking a drop that could be anywhere around 100 foot or more onto the deck below. The fighting. Pirate ships were chosen to prioritize speed, maneuverability, and space below decks for loot. They weren't chosen to be fighting machines, but inevitably there were occasions when pirates would have to stand and fight. Fighting is never a comfortable or safe thing to do, but in the golden age of piracy, you might argue that it was even worse. Pirates tried to avoid fighting as much as possible, preferring to sneak up on their target and then intimidate their opponents into surrendering. When this was normally a sparsely manned merchant ship, it was often a successful tactic. But when you lost the element of surprise, a pirate had to be ready to stand and fight, whether that was with cannon and shot or with cold steel. Swords were one of the most commonly used weapons during the golden age of piracy, as guns were unreliable and could accidentally cause a fire on board if a spark landed in the wrong place. They also required ammunition and a place to store the powder and shot where it wouldn't get wet, much more difficult to care for than a sword. Pirate ships also had cannons as a regular part of their arsenal, despite their weight and generally cumbersome nature. Each cannon needed 4 men to operate it in battle, from loading and aiming the cannon to firing and repositioning it. Cannonballs were devastatingly destructive to both ships and crew, with most cannons being able to fire a cannonball between 700 and 1000 yards towards an enemy ship. If it hit, it would impact the ship at such a high velocity that it would shred sails, knock mast down, and smash through the sides of the ship, creating massive splinters of timber that would fly around the inside of the cabin and rip through anyone unlucky enough to be in the way. The accommodation. Nobody expects a pirate ship to be the Ritz, but the sleeping quarters truly left a lot to be desired and would probably turn most modern people's stomachs to imagine living in such squalor. Living at sea for weeks or months at a time took its toll on personal hygiene, especially as most pirates only had one set of clothes. This meant that pirates stank pretty much all the time, and it only got worse as scurvy set in and started causing practical halitosis as their gums started rotting. Pirates also didn't have the luxury of a comfortable bed. Depending on the ship, the crew could well be forced to find a space on the floor if they didn't have enough hammocks. If you were lucky enough to get a hammock, it wasn't guaranteed that you wouldn't be sharing it with other crew members, both human and animal. Rats and other vermin were common bunkmates for the crew, living among the pirates and getting into everything from food to spare ropes, chewing on everything they could find and spreading disease to all they touched. The medicine. Between poor nutrition, exposure to the elements, disease, and wounds from fighting, pirates often needed medical attention. But getting treated wasn't as easy as going to the ship's surgeon and getting painkillers and a nice lie down. Life on a pirate ship was incredibly hard, and the medicine was no exception. Any pills that a pirate was told to take would have to be made by hand by the ship's surgeon, and if the crew didn't have a man on board with medical training, they would simply appoint someone else to do the role, whether or not he knew a man's humerus from his metatarsal. Medicine in the 17th and 18th centuries was clearly not as advanced as the procedures we can do today, but on board a moving ship in the middle of the ocean, it was even more limited. If you broke your leg or got injured in any way, it was a 50-50 chance whether you'd get to keep your injured limb. Amputation was a common approach. The chance of infection was also drastically high, as it was practically impossible to keep a sterile environment on board the ship. Medicine had to be carefully guarded, as it was always at risk of rotting as the ship was always damp, and if they weren't careful then water would get into the medicine chest and destroy their supplies. Two illnesses that are easily identified and treated today, yet were frequently fatal for pirates: dysentery and scurvy. Scurvy is probably the one most associated with pirates, as it's linked closely to their experiences on a pirate ship. Without vitamin C, the body starts to break down as it can't sustain your immune system, produce collagen, or even heal wounds as well. This means that pirates would have been irritable, in constant pain, lethargic, and oozing bloods from wounds that won't heal. The other common disease was dysentery, which was caused by eating contaminated food or drinking dirty water. As mentioned before, pirate ships were rife with rodents and other vermin, and the food stores were often moldy after only a few weeks to a month. This meant that dysentery was a constant concern and could decimate a crew if it cropped up on the ship. The symptoms were excruciating too, and would have added to the general unpleasantness in the crew's quarters. Getting sick is never enjoyable, but imagine having a crew who are dealing with bloody diarrhea, have no access to running water, no clean clothes, and probably use a bucket in the corner of the room to relieve themselves. The punishments. Life at sea was hard and discipline was swift and harsh. Ship's officers needed to make sure that everything ran smoothly, and so even stepping a single toe out of line could lead to brutal punishments. The most common punishment was flogging, where the pirate who needed to be punished would be tied to the mast or a barrel and then whipped with the end of a rope, or perhaps the infamous cat o' nine tails. Getting flogged was pretty common, but was no less horrifying for how frequently it occurred. If done carefully, flogging would not kill you, but would hurt a lot. You'd suffer deep bruises and cuts across your back. If done on bare skin, or perhaps with the cat o' nine tails, you'd almost definitely suffer worse, deeper cuts, which would leave you open to infections and possibly even nerve damage if it happened regularly enough. More dastardly pirates could face even worse punishments depending on the severity of their crimes. Some would be summarily shot, others would be imprisoned in tiny cages with nothing to eat but stale bread, and yet others would be keel-hauled. The work. Work on a pirate ship was hard and dangerous, particularly in bad weather. Going up into the rigging to fix the sails or ropes was dangerous, and many pirates lost their lives after they lost their grip on a slippery spar as the ship rolled. Other dangerous roles would be the powder monkey, the job given to young boys who would need to run gunpowder from below decks to the cannon crews during a battle. This job was incredibly risky, as they'd need to be running around in the middle of a fight and carrying highly explosive powder as the ship was taking a beating around them. Cabin boys didn't fare much better, being treated as slaves by the officers and forced to wait on them hand and foot 24 hours a day. So, do you think you have what it takes to survive on a pirate ship? From the weather to stinking bedmates, everything was hard and cruel on board the ship. You'd face boiling heat, freezing cold, mold, rats, lice, and waves that would sweep you overboard and to your death. And that doesn't even touch what would happen to you if you got on the wrong side of the captain or one of his officers. Getting marooned and left with a single bullet in your pistol would be the least of your worries then. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Walk the Plank. Please let us know in the comments below whether you think you could last on a pirate ship, and I'll see you next week for another video. Cheers!